explain what ontological anthropological means in the other lecture. Another term for that, maybe simpler, would be metaphysical foundations. And I explained the meaning of the principles of causality, finality, and change. Okay. So now that we know what the principles of causality, finality, and change are, and the different kinds of causality, we can now talk about being in general and also apply those principles to the question of God's existence. So, when we talk about being in general, there are a few things that we can say about every being insofar as it exists. So, we can say about every being insofar as it exists that it's one, that it's true, that it's good, and some say that we can say that it's beautiful, that it's relational and dynamic. And why? So what are the arguments? Just real briefly, we can't cover in detail the arguments for these things. You would cover this in a metaphysics class, a college course called Metaphysics in a philosophy department. But the question, age-old question of the one and the many is, how do we come about, how does multiplicity come about? Okay, in other words, how does the existence of the multiple come about? Okay, so if you think about everything insofar as it exists is one thing, right? Like this desk is a desk. It's not multiple desks. It's just a desk. Okay, everything is one before it's many. Before you consider many things, you consider the one thing. Okay, simply put. So I think that's the easiest to see. Now, everything is true. What does that mean? Simply that everything is a potential object of understanding. In other words, everything is intelligible. Now that comes from the principle of contradiction in logic, that something cannot be true and false at the same time in the same way. If that's the case, then everything is intelligible. There's a reason or an explanation for everything. That means that everything is at least a potential object of understanding. Okay. So, in other words, if truth is the agreement of the mind with reality, then everything could be understood. And in that sense, everything is true in itself. Okay, so everything insofar as it exists is true, that meaning intelligible, or an object of the intellect. All right, so also everything is a potential object of desire, or an object of the will. So everything insofar as it exists could be chosen, all right, or desired. Simply put, the good is what's desirable. So even if we choose something that objectively is evil, we're choosing it insofar as it is thought of as good for us in the moment, right? So we desire it for whatever reason, whatever that reason might be. So it has to exist first for it to be desirable. It has to exist first for it to be understandable. And everything insofar as it exists is understandable, and potentially desirable. So everything that exists is therefore true and good insofar as it exists. That's all that means. And then the beautiful could be defined in multiple different ways. That's a more complicated field of study called aesthetics. There are some Latin terms that are typically used to define what's beautiful. Usually harmony of various parts, proportion, in other words, okay, the integrity of the parts to the whole, etc. Clarity, okay. In other words, the relationship between the parts and the whole. And the dynamism of things. If you take like a physics class, and especially at the college level, you'll learn about the dynamism of everything in the universe. Everything is moving in some way, even a subatomic level. So that's another possible transcendental. So all these things are called transcendentals, and that simply means that it's the broadest category of thing. Okay. So it applies to everything that exists or potentially exists. Okay. So that's all that transcendental means. It's the broadest category of thing. And again, recall here the idea also that being is analogically structured. What does that mean? Well, it simply means that it's something between what's univocal and equivocal. So some terminology here, review of terminology. Remember, univocal is when two things have the exact same relationship to each other. So they're completely similar to one another. Equivocal is the opposite. They're completely dissimilar from one another. Okay. So an analogical relationship is when two or more things are related to one another both by similarity and dissimilarity. Okay. So to say that being is analogically structured simply means that all beings are similar to one another insofar as they exist. They have that similarity at least with one another. And they also have these similarities, right, that follow from their existence. They're one, they're true, they're good, etc., etc. You might say they have essences. In other words, you can say things about them. Okay? And yet they're different from one another at the same time. Everything that exists is distinct from everything else. Okay? They have distinct essences. All right? So that analogical structure, in other words, the fact that they are similar and dissimilar from one another, also creates a scale of participation, if you will. So, for example, the fact that plants exist on one level of existence that is, you might say, more perfect than the level of existence that rocks exist on. Okay, because they have vegetative capabilities. Okay, and then you might say animals have a certain level of existence that is more perfect than the level of existence that just plants have, because they also have sentient capabilities, not just vegetative capabilities. And then, Homo sapiens has rational capabilities that other animals do not have. Okay, and the capacity to freely choose. Okay, and so that's another perfection that elevates us above the other animals. Okay, so that's a scale of participation. Now, how high does that scale go? We move on to the arguments for the existence of God. Recalling these principles of causality, finality, and change. First, the principle of causality, quick review, is that every cause is in some sense, namely ontologically, greater than its effect. In other words, the effect pre-exists in its cause. And that comes from the ancient axiom that from nothing, nothing comes. In other words, something cannot come from nothing. And so something more perfect cannot be caused by something less perfect. Okay, so we just talked about that scale of perfection. So a plant cannot bring about an animal. All right. And if you think about evolution and you have questions about that, listen to the previous lecture. There's no contradiction between that principle and the fact of evolution. All right. The principle of finality is that everything acts for a purpose. So every action is for some goal. Okay, even if it's seemingly aimless, there's always some goal that's being sought after. All right, whether it's more immediate or less immediate. And then the principle of change is a little more complicated, invoking the ideas of act and potency. Okay. And I gave the example of how I'm actually standing right here, but I'm potentially standing over there. And we have the phenomenon of change. Now I'm actualizing my potency to be over there. Now I'm actually right here. I just moved. Okay. So that's one way of explaining the phenomenon of change, is the concepts of act and potency. Okay. Act and potency are distinct things. I'm actually right here. I'm not actually over there. I'm potentially over there. All right. So the principle of change is that something cannot be in act and potency at the same time in the same way. In other words, I'm actually right here, but I'm not actually over there. And if I want to be actually over there, I have to actualize my potency to move over there. And when I actualize my potency to move over there, it's actually my mind actualizing the potency of my legs to be moved, to move my body over there. So it's not my body simply moving itself, but it's my mind moving my body. And then it's my mind moves itself, right? But it's one part of my mind moving another part of my mind. And in the theory of knowledge, Aristotle came up with this principle. He was originally a biologist and a physician, but also most known as a philosopher. He talked about the agent intellect actualizing the possible intellect. Okay, and then the question becomes, well, what actualizes the agent intellect? And that's where we get into the argument from the first mover for the argument for the existence of God. Okay. So if you watch Bishop Barron's video about the argument for the first mover argument, he says nothing moves itself. That's what he means. That I cannot be in act and potency at the same time in the same way. In other words, act and potency are distinct realities. And so anytime any potency is actualized, it's actualized by an agent that is external to the potency. Okay, that's distinct from the potency. Now recall the different kinds of causality. The formal, material, efficient, and final causality. We have formal and material are internal to the thing or intrinsic to the thing. So the desk, right? We have the materials out of which the desks are made, and the form or the shape or the arrangement of the materials that make the desk look the way it does, the definition of what the desk is. Those are intrinsic causes. The extrinsic causes, by way of review, are the efficient and final causes. Okay? So who put the desk together or what put the desk together? So did a machine put the desk together? If a machine put the desk together, who put that machine together that put the desk together? If a machine put the machine together that put the desk together, who put that machine together that put the machine together that put the desk together, etc. And was there a first mover, if you will, in that series? Or is there an infinite regress? All right. Was there a machine that made the machine that made the machine that made the desk? Or where did it start off? Okay, can you go back ad infinitum? Does that make sense? Or did the series start off somewhere? Okay. Well, the first mover argument says, talking about the universe or creation in general, the world in general, that there had to be a first mover. There had to be something that started it all off. That started off motion or change. When he says motion, he means change in general, not just physical motion. Okay. So anytime any potency is actualized, that's called motion or change. But that first mover that started off the process of motion is more actualized than the later movers. Okay? So the principle of causality from nothing, nothing comes. So the more perfect can't come from the less perfect. So in other words, the first mover argument comes to, the result is this first act, that is pure act. The unmoved mover is pure act. Okay? It argues that it's impossible for there to be an infinite regress. All right, so the argument goes, there's the fact of motion. There must be an explanation for motion or change. Okay. It's impossible for there to be an infinite regress in movers. Therefore, there must be a first mover. That first mover must be unmoved. Okay, given the premises I just gave, for there to be an explanation for change. And that unmoved mover, given the explanation of change as the actualization of potency, is pure act. Okay. The second argument is very similar, but it doesn't have directly to do with change. It just has to do with being in general. So the first cause argument. So using the principle of causality, which I just invoked a little bit talking about the first mover argument to clarify it, but the first cause argument is very similar, talking from the principle of causality rather than strictly from the principle of change. The principle of change, I think, is a little more complicated to understand, but the principle of causality is that a superior being cannot come from an inferior being. So the effect pre-exists in its cause. Does being is the world as we know it, is it uncaused? Well, if the principle of sufficient reason says that there must be an explanation for everything, and so if it were uncaused, there would be no explanation for it. Okay, so if there's an explanation for it, what's the explanation for the world? And then if there's some explanation for the world, that's a cause, right? Now, is there some explanation for that cause? In other words, is there a cause of that cause? Okay. And if there's a cause of that cause, then is there a cause of that cause? And if there's a cause of that cause, is there a cause of that cause? Okay, and could we go ad infinitum all the way back? And keep asking that? The argument goes, that's impossible, because if you could say that there's a cause of the cause of the cause of the cause forever and ever, well then there would be no explanation. That's the same thing as saying that there's no explanation at all of the current world as it exists, of our reality. And so there must be some first cause, and that first cause must be uncaused. Okay? And therefore there must be some cause, some reality that explains itself. This reality in which we exist does not explain itself. That reality that explains itself would be a perfect reality. Okay. Which kind of leads into the other argument from the reality of participation, which is called the fourth way in St. Thomas's 5 ways. I have the link, by the way, to St. Thomas's famous 5 ways down there that you can find online, which this is based on. You can find his articulation of it, but I'm paraphrasing here. So skipping to the to the fourth way, is the argument from participation, which arrives at the notion of a supreme being, which goes back to this idea of being as analogically structured. So it says, okay, we recognize things that are better and lesser good. Okay, more and less good. All right, so we recognize whether it be in our lives, okay, this is a better choice than that is. Or whether it be what I was talking about earlier. Animals have higher capacities, more perfect capacities than mere plants. Okay, so the question then is, is there a ceiling, if it were, as it were, to the top, to that scale of participation? As we go up, okay, is there a ceiling? Can you continue to go up the scale? Is there an infinite, is there no absolute against which all these degrees are measured? Does that make sense? Or must there be an absolute for there to be various degrees? In other words, he argues there must be, in order for us to say more and less, okay, something is more or less good, there must be an absolute good against which all finite goods are measured. It wouldn't make sense to talk about something as more or less good if there were not an absolute good, in which all those finite goods participate. Okay, so that's more of a Platonic argument. We could go into more detail, but speeding up to the fifth argument is from the principle of finality, which might follow a little bit easier from the principle, and it's a question more of whether you grant the principle in the beginning. Some people might just dismiss it from the beginning, which is the principle of finality, that everything acts for a reason. So every action is for a reason. And one might argue for that principle from the principle of sufficient reason. If there's a reason for everything, which comes from the principle of contradiction, right? If there's a reason for everything, then there's a reason for every action. Action is a thing. If there's a reason for every action, then there's a goal. In other words, for every action. Reason is another word. A goal would be another word for action. A goal would be another word for reason in relation to action. Okay? So then there's a goal or a purpose for every action. And so, in other words, every action would have an ultimate goal or an approximate or some goal, right? And so the question is, are there only proximate goals, meaning goals closer to us? Or is there an ultimate goal towards which all things tend? And if there were no ultimate goal of the universe, let's say, then there could be no proximate goals. There could be no subsequent goals without an ultimate goal towards which those subsequent goals would be subordinate. Okay. Another way of arguing it is giving an analogy of, he gives the analogy of the archer with the arrow. He shoots the arrow, and the arrow is directed towards the bullseye. Okay, think of the universe as the arrow. Okay, if the arrow is not directed towards the bullseye, if it's not directed towards anything, it's just aimless. Okay, but using scientific information, you probably heard of like intelligent design, which has kind of been hijacked by creationists, but they're also evolutionists who believe in it. There's evidence, scientific evidence for intelligent design in the universe, that the universe is actually going somewhere, that there's a goal for the universe. Okay. So that would be support for this argument that there's a purpose towards which the universe is heading. All right. The third way, which is my favorite, but it's a little more philosophical, is, real quick, that first there's a distinction between essence and existence. In other words, what I am and the fact that I exist. Okay? And in other words, that means that I could not be. I could not exist. It's not necessary that I exist. Okay? But I do exist. There was a time when I didn't exist. Right now I do exist, but it's possible for me not to exist at any moment. Right? Now, if all of us, if all creatures, if all things had that possibility of not existing, Imagine a world in which God didn't exist. So let's suppose that God doesn't exist, that there is no necessary being, that all things have the potential not to exist. And here's that word potential or potency again. Then given infinite time, okay, imagine a world of infinite time, infinite potential time, then at some point in time, for that potential to be real, each thing would have to not exist. For that potency to be real, it would have to not exist at some point in that infinite time. Now, for that to be true, now if each thing at some point in that infinite time didn't exist, then how could it come into existence if it didn't exist? If it's possible, if it has the potential not to exist, it could not exist, then it must at some point not exist. And think of the world as a whole. Okay? If it's possible for the world as a whole not to exist, then it has the potential not to exist. Then if it has a real potential not to exist, then given infinite time, at some point in time it would have not existed. And from nothing, nothing comes. Therefore, if there were no God, there would be no existence. The world could not exist. Okay? And in other words, there has to be a being that cannot not exist. There has to be a being that's necessary for there to be beings that are contingent or finite. In other words, there has to be a necessary being for there to be beings in which essence and existence are distinct from one another. Okay. And I think that that's all the time we have to talk about this. There's another argument called the Ontological Argument. You can look it up. It's a little more complicated and it's disputed. A little more disputed. I mean, people dispute every argument, but and also encourage you to look if you're interested in these. There's a book by Peter Kreeft called the Handbook of Christian Apologetics. He's a professor at Boston College. He's got 20 arguments for the existence of God there collected. It was one of the first books that I read on this topic when I was an atheist that convinced me that God exists. So. All right, so we have talked about the 5 ways real quickly. There's also this other argument that's actually more popular in contemporary philosophical circles called the Ontological Argument. Originated with St. Anselm of Canterbury. Various modern philosophers have reformulated it. You can look that up. We won't talk about it. It gets pretty complicated, especially in the modern formulations. There's a famous mathematician, one of the greatest mathematicians, especially the 20th century, Kurt Gödel, who put this in a very complicated mathematical formula. That's actually an argument for God's existence. So that's interesting, but it's beyond the scope of this class. So the 5 ways here end up, a lot of people will kind of get the arguments, they'll read the arguments, and they'll say, okay, that makes sense to me, but it doesn't seem to prove the existence of the God that I believe in as a Christian, let's say. So the question is, what do the arguments actually prove? So the various arguments prove or purport to prove that God is these various things. And this is kind of left out in a lot of explanations. And I'll explain what these concepts are. Okay. Pure act. Pure act, if you recall from the principle of change, the principle of change is, again, that something cannot be in act and potency at the same time in the same way. All right, what does that mean? So when something changes, that's the actualization of a potency. All right, I kind of explained that in the previous lecture. So act is the principle of perfection. So the act that's actualizing the potency is the principle of perfection. And so in the first mover argument, we arrive to a first mover that has no potency, that has no potential for change, that is responsible for all the subsequent changes. Okay. So that unmoved mover that is proven in that argument of the first mover argument, the first way, is therefore pure act. And then from that proof of this being that is pure act is deduced, remember the term deduction from logic, is deduced from pure act certain divine attributes. Okay. So those attributes commonly known as omniscience or knowing all things, omnipotence or having all power, and omnibenevolence or being all good. And those things come from the transcendentals, which we just talked about. At being as one, being as good, being as true. Okay. So if God is pure act, in other words, he is pure being, is the principle of all change. He's unmoved. Okay. He's omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent. So that's where those attributes come from. Likewise, in the argument for the first cause, in the first cause argument, the second way, he's not only the cause of all change, but the cause of all being. Okay, and so if he's the cause of all being, then he is one, true, and good. So he's the cause of all power, knowledge, goodness. And if he's the cause of all those things, by the principle of causality, all effects pre-exist in their cause. And so all those things pre-exist in him in an immanent fashion. Okay, meaning in an infinite degree. Because, and this this leads into the third way, or rather into the fourth way, sorry. The fourth way is the way from participation, that we just talked about, where the argument goes that there's a less and a more or less, and therefore there must be an absolute against which all these various degrees are measured. If there were not an absolute against which the various degrees were measured, there could not be differences in degree. Okay, so the terminus, in other words, the end result of that argument is a being that is supreme. Okay, a most perfect being. Because we talked about the scale of perfection of beings. If there's a scale of perfection, and we asked whether or not there's a ceiling to that scale. And if there is a scale, then there has to be an absolute against which those more or less are measured. That's the supreme being. So the fifth way is, the end result of the fifth way is that God is this intelligent governor, and that comes from the principle of finality, that everything acts for a purpose. In other words, every action, there's a reason for every act. Just like there's a reason for every being, every action has a goal. And so there's an ultimate goal for the universe. And if there's an ultimate goal, or if the universe is goal-oriented, then there must be some intelligence behind it. And as everything that is goal-oriented it desires something in some sense, and the good is what's desirable, then that being, the intelligent governor, must also be good. So you see how these attributes, in some sense, come directly from the being that is proven from these various ways, and also from knowing the transcendentals. Okay, and that's why I covered the transcendentals before covering the arguments for God's existence. Now, on the other side, before covering the arguments for God's existence, St. Thomas gives the arguments that are commonly launched against God's existence. and then he answers those later. So if you look at the Summa Theologiae, which is his most famous work, he'll start out with objections. So if you look at this link, he'll start out with objections, which are arguments against his position. All right? And then he'll give his position. All right, he'll give his position, and then he'll answer those objections at the end, in particular, in detail. All right, so first, in the question of whether God exists, he gives arguments against God's existence. And then he gives arguments for God's existence, and then he gives answers for why those arguments against God's existence don't work. Okay, so the argument, it's the existence of evil, right? One of the videos you watched was about that. And the presenter of that video gave a different explanation of evil than St. Thomas does. St. Thomas's answer is interesting as well, and there are other answers. The argument against God's existence is simply evil exists, right? And if God is good and all wise and all powerful, well then why does evil exist? Therefore, there must not be an all wise and all good God, right? Or an all powerful and all good God. Evil wouldn't exist. He wouldn't allow that to happen. An all powerful and all good God would not allow evil to happen, is the argument. So, St. Augustine's argument, which St. Thomas inherits and accepts, is that God allows evil to happen because he's so powerful that he's able to bring good even out of evil. So in other words, he allows evil to happen, but he brings good out of it. Okay, so we might not be able to see in the moment what that good is, but sometimes in life we might see, okay, this evil happened, and later on we'll realize, oh, well, if that hadn't happened, then this other good thing might not have happened, might not have come out of that. Okay, maybe earlier on in life you might not see that. Later on you'll experience that. Something maybe a little more immediately satisfying from a philosophical perspective would be Aquinas' argument that he gives, which is that evil is a lack of a good that should be there. That should ring bells because we talked about that. A lack of a good that should be there is how evil is defined. Okay, that it's possible for finite goods to cause evil, right? We can bring about lacks or absences of good, and that the infinite good simply permits that causation. In other words, the infinite good creates us free. He gave us freedom. And not just freedom for moral evil, but he gives a certain freedom to nature in a sense. That the world he creates has its own abilities to create evils, natural evils. And that leads into the final point, which is that you have to distinguish first between different kinds of evils before you deal with the problem of evil. And of course, none of this is satisfying to the personal experience of evil that we have to overcome, right? But on an abstract level, we can kind of try to grapple with it. So first, there are different kinds of evil. First, later philosophers will talk about ontological evil, which would simply be the fact that we're imperfect as creatures, that none of us are perfect. All right. Moral evil would be any bad choices that we make. Okay. But other evils would be natural evils, like natural disasters, right, that might happen that have nothing to do with our choices. Now, in the Christian tradition, there's also the explanation of original sin. That originally, which you may or may not believe, it takes faith to believe this tradition or not, that God originally created the world perfect in the sense that Yes, we're creatures, but there were no natural disasters. None of that was supposed to happen. But mankind rebelled against God, and God allowed that to happen. And as a result, nature then deteriorated, and natural disasters happened as a result. Okay. In other words, He created us with the freedom to choose evil. We chose evil. Our first parents chose evil. And as a natural result, creation, since we're the head of creation, nature followed with us. And so evil things started happening in nature as well.
So you're saying